All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I know that we're probably going to have people filtering in and out as we go, but I'm just really thrilled to be here talking with you all today about a little bit about my doctorate research. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a couple things logistically. Number one, I would love for this to be somewhat of a discussion as well as just a presentation. I've got about 40 minutes or so prepared to talk to you about, but if at any point you have a question or just want to get some clarity on something that I've been talking about, it's a pretty dense topic. Feel free to drop it either in the Zoom chat or in the Facebook live chat, and that'll be piped into the Zoom chat. I have it up on my computer so I can kind of respond to that in more or less real time. And I'm happy to kind of take little breaks here and there to address those questions as they come up. Number two, just for me, I have been having some Zoom connectivity issues recently. So if for some reason I drop out, I've done everything possible to make sure that that doesn't happen. I'm going to be back within 30 seconds or so. So just so you know, don't leave. The show's not over early or anything like that. And so that's just for you guys to be aware of if that happens. And finally, I want to say a huge thank you to the North American Saxophone Alliance and especially the Committee on the Status of Women for hosting this webinar. I've been really inspired by the response over the past month by the Committee on the Status of Women, as well as the Saxophone Studio class online, to just share all of the different research and interesting ideas that our field has. And I'm thrilled that my research is being shared as just my own small contribution to everything that's been put out there. And I hope you guys enjoy what I have to talk about today. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of dive straight in. And again, if anybody has any questions and wants to get some more clarity, please just let me know. So I'm talking today about my doctorate research down at the University of Georgia, which I've entitled Creative Placemaking and Musical Study in Higher Education, a History and Practical Considerations for Students and Faculty. And the way that I'm going to kind of break that down today is I'm going to talk to you about what creative placemaking is, and also the ways that it can be potentially used to advance the goals of the Committee on the Status of the Women, especially advocacy and allyship, which are an important part of what this organization does for the North American Saxophone Alliance. And I believe that there are some parallels between the research that I've done into creative placemaking and that mission. So in addition to defining what creative placemaking is, I'm also hoping to demonstrate the benefits for both students and faculty for incorporating the study of creative placemaking into music programs in higher education. Furthermore, I'm looking to identify the core principles of successful creative placemaking. And these are things that exist outside of the standard music performance curriculum. So they may be skills or knowledge that's endemic to another field like music therapy or music education. But they aren't things that we typically study in music performance. And that's important because that's the field that I'm both most familiar with, and it's also the field that's perhaps most far removed from really good training in creative placemaking. And finally, this research sought to identify the principal challenges to teaching creative placemaking in higher education. So before I get into the nuts and bolts about what creative placemaking is and how to apply it to higher ed and how to apply it to advocacy and allyship, I wanted to share the story of kind of how I got involved in this field and in this research. So I think it might resonate with some of you. So I started this journey into getting advanced degrees in saxophone in very much the traditional way to, I think, a lot of my peers. I got an undergraduate degree in saxophone performance at the University of Illinois, graduated from there and went on to get a master's degree in saxophone at the Eastman School of Music, and just completed the doctorate degree in saxophone at the University of Georgia. And I'm now out on the job market looking for jobs, mostly in higher ed. And that's fairly typical, I think, of what a lot of my peers and those of us in the field, we can relate to that. And what we also can relate to is what I went through during the last semester of my master's degree, which in the music industry and especially in the saxophone world, we would call a textbook case of burnout. And so I was working really, really hard, spending a lot of time practicing, doing chamber music rehearsals, going and doing chamber music in solo competitions, playing in ensembles, doing classwork. and was just starting to feel a little bit like I wasn't sure why I was doing what I was doing, if it was worth it, and if all of this time and effort really made sense. And what I knew was that I didn't want to give up saxophone. I didn't want to leave music. That was always something that was important to me, but it just felt like something was missing. And I wasn't really able to put a finger on what that was. And what eventually helped me sort of find my way through the weeds was two things. One, I took a class through the Arts Leadership Program at the Eastman School of Music that was just a broad survey class about leadership issues in music. And one of the weeks we talked about the concept of citizen artistry, which is another name that describes a similar set of activities to creative placemaking. And I was just so inspired to learn about the ways that these musicians were making a difference in their community and the ways that their music making was being impacted. And it started to connect with me in terms of a past life, in a way of, I've always had a lifelong interest in service work. I grew up and achieved the Eagle Scout rank and made an Eagle Scout service project that I created and led. I've done many different mission trips through church and other organizations, and just always had an interest in helping others. And it felt sort of like the perfect merging of these two different parts of myself, this interest in service work and in helping communities, and also saxophone and music and performing. And so that started to really got the ball rolling for me of this might be something I'm interested in chasing down. And almost within a couple weeks of learning about that, I took a DMA. Sorry if you can hear that. Somebody's banging on the desk upstairs or something like that. I'm not sure what. I took a DMA audition at the University of Georgia. And what I didn't realize at the time, but learned very quickly, was that this was a field that Dr. Frigo down at the University of Georgia was also interested in. And so we spent almost the entire DMA interview just talking about this field and sort of our mutual interest in it. And quickly she became just an inspiration and a huge mentor to me to start thinking about the way that I related to this field and the way that my music making related to this sort of side of myself. And so from pretty much day one of the doctorate degree, I was thinking about how I could incorporate this in some way into my study. And what this eventually turned into was a DMA project where I was really thinking about the ways that we could apply community engagement and creative placemaking to higher education. And so I did this in a couple of different ways. I got a certificate in nonprofit management organization and leadership through the School of Social Work at the University of Georgia, in addition to getting the doctorate. And I also tried to put into action two different projects with student composer friends around Athens to try and figure out some of the ways to make this stuff work. One of those projects was with a student composer who primarily works in electroacoustic music. And she was interested in sort of the diversity issues at play in electroacoustic music, specifically that field is primarily a male and white dominated field. And she herself is a Caucasian female. And she was interested in what we could potentially do to address some of those issues. And so what we ended up doing was creating a music technology and pretty much garage band class that was offered through an after-school academic enrichment program at a local middle school near Athens. And we were just completely blown away within the first couple of weeks of offering that class with the imagination and the creativity, but also just the speed at which the students learned. These were all middle school aged girls, and all of them were also of color. And we were just so blown away with the way that they used these tools that we were providing to really express themselves. Unfortunately, we weren't able to see that course to its conclusion. We've been doing it over the past year, but had to stop due to the pandemic. So it was unfortunate that we weren't able to finish it out. But we were really pleased with what we were able to accomplish with the time that we had, and also what we learned. The other project that I tried to put into place, and I use the word tried on purpose here, was with another student composer. We tried to create a piece that celebrated the cultural diversity of Athens. And it was a piece of music or performance art that would have been done at a local festival to really celebrate the unique cultural background in Athens. We have, of course, a very populous group of students and teachers and professionals that live and work at the University of Georgia, but also a significant African-American and Latinx population within the Athens community. And we wanted to try and find a way to bring all of those communities together to celebrate what brings us together and instead of divides us. And so over the course of several months, we sent emails and phone calls and social media invitations to different community organizers, activists, and cultural organizations around Athens to see if we could find a partner to create this project. And over the course of about 6 months, we got 0 responses. Nobody ever wrote us back. And what we realized through that process was this idea of who were we for them to respond to us. Before those emails were sent or those invitations were made or the offers to meet up and create a project, we had never shown any interest or investment in the work that they were doing. And so there wasn't a mutual trust built up that would really create something meaningful, especially a musical performance. And this was a huge learning experience for us and actually was a big foundation of a lot of the research that I did. So now that I've kind of talked a little bit about how I got into it and what I've been doing to sort of pursue that, I wanted to define creative placemaking. And I'm doing this for 2 reasons. One, scholarship shows that creative placemaking is a relatively fuzzy field. This is in part because it's also a very young field. It's only about 10 years old. The term creative placemaking comes from a research paper that was published by the National Endowment for the Arts. That was a response to a place-based mandate for place-based solutions to the 2008 economic recession by the Obama administration. And so this is what the NEA came up with. And what really they did was they looked at what artists and musicians and dramatists and writers all around the country were doing to really activate the sense of community. And then they just gathered it all together and stuck a label on it and called it creative placemaking. And so many of the people that have been practicing this have been doing it for 50 to 100 years even, but now they have a label with significant money behind it, and they're now calling their work creative placemaking. And so if you talked to 20 different artists or creative placemakers about what creative placemaking is, you would probably get 20 different definitions. Also, since I'm applying creative placemaking to music and higher education, it felt useful to create my own definition. Because this field has got its start in the visual arts sphere and is still mostly practiced there, and it's not really practiced very much in higher ed. So I'm defining creative placemaking in this research as the strategic reimagining of the boundary around arts, culture, and education so that they become essential parts of work in community development and social activism. And creative placemaking is defined by 3 central tenets. It's defined by sincerity, which really refers to the motivations for getting involved in creative placemaking. You can't get involved in this work to satisfy degree requirements or put into a promotion or tenure portfolio or even complete like a project deadline. The motivation for getting involved in this is to create a relationship between artists and their community and to build something artistic out of that is of mutual benefit to both parties. This doesn't mean that a community engaged project or a socially minded musical composition isn't sincere. It just means that creative placemaking projects show evidence of investment in a relationship between the artists and the communities. And you can do this through showing a history of volunteer work or statements by both organizations and the artists that say that they're working together for a common goal, things like that. Creative placemaking is also characterized by depth. And this is depth of relationship building and also the spirit of inquiry that's at the heart of creative placemaking. So the relationships need to be deep. They're built on mutual trust and sort of repeated investment by both the artists and the community in each other's work and what they can grow together through that work. And then in that process, there's a spirit of inquiry that's very important. So when doing a project like this, you need to be thinking together about what the goals are that you're trying to address. What are the issues that are being tackled by this project? And what are the methods for achieving those goals? And most often, you need to be constantly reevaluating both of those things, both the goals and the methods for achieving those goals. And so there's this idea of sort of constantly returning to the table inherent in creative placemaking work. both from the perspective of the community and also from the perspective of the artist. And finally, creative placemaking is characterized by commitment. And this is what really separates creative placemaking from what we in the music world call community engagement. So community engagement, at least when we think about it in musical terms, especially in higher ed, we think about sending out a chamber music group and playing at a local festival, or maybe doing a performance for a couple different classes at a local school. And the difference between this and creative placemaking is that creative placemaking focuses on the continuation of that effort after that first performance. How has that relationship continually grown and returned to create new projects, to create new relationships, and to bring out more meaning and impact? And so it's more than just a one-off performance to get outside of the walls of the School of Music or outside of the walls of the concert hall, but it's continued investment in getting out into the community and building something greater than the sum of its parts. So to clarify some of these things that play in the definition, I wanted to talk briefly about 3 different nonprofit organizations that I looked at for this research. And this is going to be very surface level, bird's eye view looks at the massive amount of work that these organizations do. This first organization is the Sphinx organization. And this is a Detroit, Michigan-based organization that calls themselves a social justice organization dedicated to transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. And the way that they do this is through a variety of different programs. They have an orchestra and chamber music ensemble that tour and record internationally. They have an international young artist competition for musicians of African American and Latinx descent. This is the community that they work with. They also have a variety of different learning opportunities available around Detroit and Michigan for young students to learn string instruments. And finally, they have a wide variety of different funding opportunities and grants available for young students and pre-professional musicians, again, of African American and Latinx descent, to really get their career off on the right foot. And what this organization is really focused on is this idea of relevance and allowing the classical music industry, and especially string playing, to look a little bit more like our society looks like today. I also looked at Silk Road, which is an organization started in the late 90s by cellist Yo-Yo Ma that is designed to advance global understanding, deepen learning, and promote cross-cultural collaboration. And again, they do this through a variety of different ways. The most notable is through the Silk Road Ensemble, which is a collective of musicians from a wide variety of different instruments and cultural and artistic backgrounds that come together to create a brand new repertoire that sounds unlike anything else that has really been produced. And so you have an organization and a group of performers on stage where you might hear Indian tabla drumming with Galician bagpipe playing and Romanian folk singing all coming together to create something that's just completely new and different, but also very refreshing and illuminates the ways that we are connected across boundaries and in the margins of our cultural differences. They also host a summer festival every summer to bring people in and learn this style of music making and study with the players in the ensemble. And they host university workshops throughout the year to share this kind of repertoire that they're building. And finally, I looked at the organization Street Symphony, which is a Los Angeles-based organization started by a former violinist with Los Angeles Philharmonic, Vijay Gupta. He actually has since left the orchestra and now runs this organization full-time. But this is an organization that's designed to create spaces for communities affected by homelessness and incarceration in Los Angeles County, and to share stories, deepen relationships, and illuminate our humanity through transformative musical experiences. And again, they have a variety of different programs that go towards this. They have a series of monthly performances that they do in both the prison system in Los Angeles, as well as Skid Row, which is Los Angeles County's network of homeless shelters. They have weekly music therapy and social gathering meetings set up for members of the homeless community and chamber ensembles. And they also have a training artist program where they bring in both members of Los Angeles's homeless community to receive musical training, as well as pre-professional musicians and students to really work on their community engagement shops. And they pair them up to learn from each other in terms of a way that we can create music and social services that really benefit each other. And what that organization is focused on is actually this idea that every single person, regardless of social circumstance, has the right to an artistic voice and creative expression. And so in looking at those three nonprofit organizations, I compared them to three different organizations in higher education that are teaching creative placemaking in different ways. And I'm not going to get into the details about how they're doing that. They all do it differently, but I looked at Arizona State University, I looked at the University of Michigan, and I looked at the University of Georgia. And by comparing those organizations, as well as interviewing professionals in all of those organizations, I was able to carve out a role for higher education in creative placemaking. So higher education has access to significant creative, cultural, and capital resources, especially within the communities that they reside. And these are resources that are essential to doing this work well. Also, higher education has the ability and the infrastructure necessary to do research, especially research that isn't driven by profit margin or market return. And this is important for two reasons. One, creative placemaking doesn't generate market return, or Scout, come on, come here, away from the window. Sorry, my dog. Doesn't generate market return or a profit margin, but also creative placemaking needs research. And really the reason it needs research is because it's such a young field and it's still trying to identify what its best practices are and the ways to do it ethically. And so higher education is well positioned to do research that will help that. And finally, and I think most importantly, higher education has the opportunity, or I would even say the responsibility, to train future musicians to do creative placemaking in an ethical and effective way. So now I'm going to talk about the 5 core principles of successful creative placemaking that I identified through this research. And what I'm hoping to do is also illustrate how these principles can be used to amplify the advocacy and allyship that's being practiced by the Committee on the Status of Women. So I've listed them off here. We have critical listening and empathy, cultural humility, design thinking and communication skills, project evaluation and measurement, and nonprofit management and grant writing. I'm going to get into each one a little bit and talk sort of about what are the things at play here and how can these be applied to advocacy and allyship as well as higher education. So they weren't listed in any particular order, but I do think that perhaps the most important or the foundational principle at play here is critical listening and empathy. And this is the idea of framing performances around listening and reacting to an audience more than just presenting music. Oftentimes, especially in classical music, but even in other types and genres, there's this idea of bringing music to a group of people and you're sort of bringing it down from the ivory tower. And the audience will enjoy it because it's art and because it has meaning. And this has some problems. And if we want to really create more meaningful interactions with community, especially through music, we have to approach projects differently. And so instead, they should be approached from a place of imagination and community input. So instead of saying, this is what we can do as musicians, here's what we have to offer, you say, this is what we can do as musicians. This might also be what we can learn how to do. Where within your community's dreams or goals or needs do you think we can work together to add value? And you start the discussion that way. And through that learning process, you can begin to create projects that are more impactful, more meaningful, and also, if we're relating this to advocacy and allyship, really address the problems at hand based on the understanding of the people who are living those problems. And so it's just a reframing of the mindset around how we present music and how we bring projects to life. It's also worth talking briefly here about how music and art, especially amongst musicians, has this widely acknowledged power to heal. We never really talk about it, though, beyond sort of the loftiness of it. Just like, oh, at this particular moment, the audience or myself, we felt something that changed my life. And especially when you're working with disadvantaged communities, which is what is typical of creative placemaking, that healing process has the potential to bring up really significant trauma. And how, as musicians, are we equipped to deal with that trauma is an interesting problem to consider. When talking to Street Symphony, they were very quick to point out that within all of their programming, they have licensed therapists on hand to facilitate reactions of this manner, and to really make sure that all of the artistic situations and presentations that they put together have the potential to interact with trauma and address it in an ethical and effective way. And so the musicians of Street Symphony argue that it may not be necessary to have like a fully blown music therapy curriculum pushed into a music performance curriculum, but that we should have some know-how as performers about how to deal with trauma and how to structure experiences that really address it in an ethical and effective way. Cultural humility also is a very important part of this relationship building process and the way that we frame both learning about communities and bringing projects to bear. And this is different than cultural competence. Cultural competence is sort of a problematic term because it implies an end state of knowledge where you've become an expert in a community and therefore you are able to work in it and create effective projects. But what this idea of expert really actually causes is this sort of othering of that community that you're working in and the promotion of stereotyping. And so cultural humility changes the notion of how you prepare for interactions like this into a lifelong process that's focused on the self-examination of one's own culture, your own background, and your own biases. And then you use that as a lens for learning about other cultures. And so you're using this self-awareness piece as a way to understand how you understand other cultures and make sure that everything is going according to the way that it should be. And most importantly, it is a lifelong process. You are never an expert if you're following cultural humility. You're always seeking to learn more and understand more deeply. And so again, this has very viable applications both within classical music and within advocacy and allyship. I'll use an example of classical music here. But there are traditions in classical music that are a significant barrier to entry, both for audience members, but also for musicians entering communities with which they are not familiar. So for audience members that might not know the traditions of classical music, there are very real boundaries to confront, such as how to dress when you go to a performance, or even going into the concert hall, when to clap, what's the proper etiquette for things between movements, how does the form of this piece work? There are things that get in the way of them really opening up and having an emotionally relevant experience within the music. Similarly, for musicians going out into communities, we have a lot of problems sometimes reaching communities where they are at, which is important to do in this work. Street Symphony musicians tell this really great story about how Vijay Gupta, the founder of the organization, gave a performance of the Bach Chaconne, which he considered, it's a masterpiece of that repertoire, and he considered it to be the best performance he ever gave. And when they finished, nobody clapped. And instead, somebody in the back stood up and said, "Hey, can you play something we actually care about?" And so he kind of stumbled his way through My Heart Will Go On from the Titanic, because that was what he could bring up at that very moment. But it illustrated the idea of, if you're going to try and create a relationship with a community, especially one that doesn't have a connection to the style of music that you make, you have to begin by meeting them where they are at. And so that means learning things like top 40 tunes, or learning how to play chord charts, and learning maybe popular music or whatever that particular musical culture is. And when you do that, you can build up artistic capacity. So in those weekly musical meetups that Street Symphony holds, they are doing popular music, but they're also doing very avant-garde things like Ben Johnston just intonation string quartets. And there's a musical capacity that has been built up between the artists and the community being served that allows everybody to access all of that music in all of its variety and all of its complexity and in all of its meaning. So design thinking and communication skills are also extremely important to creative placemaking. And design thinking comes from the industrial design field, and it's not applied in a one-to-one sort of ratio in creative placemaking, but really what it is a means of designing performances and concert experiences with the goal of co-creating personally relevant experiences within the music. And I'm quoting this definition from Eric Booth, who's a professor of music at Juilliard and an expert on the field of citizen artistry / creative placemaking, as well as the El Sistema movement, which is a phenomenal example of creative placemaking. And this is his definition of what it means to give a performance, what we should be shooting for, what's the goal of art. And I think it's really important that it aligns closely with the ideas at play within creative placemaking of co-creating these relevant experiences for the audience, where both everybody in the audience, as well as the musicians and other people that have come together to make this thing happen, experience something together that means something to everyone. And this touches on many different facets of the performance. It doesn't just have to be what music is played, but also what the venue is, perhaps what the audience seating arrangement looks like. How do you talk about the pieces before you play, if there is talking at all? Is there food served at the event? Is there some kind of activity before the concert gets started that sort of engages the audience in the artistic trends and framework of the music that's about to be played? Nothing is off the table here in terms of designing these experiences. And one that's perhaps the easiest for us to address as musicians, at least right off the bat without a lot of imagination, is why do we talk during performance? And it should be about more than just delivering program notes. When we think about program notes in classical music pieces, we often think about things like the history of the composer, the history of the music's composition, and oftentimes a sort of set of musical guideposts. Listen for these things at this point to sort of follow the form. And while that's all well and good, what that oftentimes does is it changes the audience notion of success from whether they had a personally relevant and artistic experience within the music to just whether they heard the guideposts or not. And it prevents that level of deeper engagement. And so we put this into practice in the University of Georgia Saxophone Studio during this academic year. We had all of the students prepare a set of program notes about their favorite piece. And then we delivered them in studio class to each other. And there were actually two sets of notes prepared. One was a set of academic program notes, just about the history of the piece and the composer. And the other was about why that piece, what experiences made that piece this person's favorite. And across the board, we found that every single person that was listening to the program notes responded more positively to the personal anecdote program notes and was more willing to invest in the hypothetical performance of the piece. They were more open to being moved. But also the person delivering the notes was vastly more comfortable delivering the personal notes as opposed to the academic set. Another quick example that I want to talk about with design thinking that I think is important to illustrate kind of how this process comes together is the piece Charlottesville, which was written by the professor of percussion, Timothy Adams, at the University of Georgia. And he wrote this piece as a response for him. He acknowledges this piece is for him. It's not for other people, but it's his response to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August of 2017. And it's his sort of working out of his feelings through music about what it means to be an African-American man raising a mixed race child in American society today. And so the piece is composed for soprano saxophone, spoken word, percussion, and electronics. And when performers were beginning to think about how to present this piece, they decided that the first performance of it should be a workshop. And so through partnerships with offices at the University of Georgia, as well as local activists and community organizers, they found an artist who was willing to donate his studio in town to host an event that would put on a performance of this piece. And then they invited a guest list of engaged citizens and community activists to hear the piece. Before they played the piece, there was a dinner that was catered. Everybody got to meet each other and sort of learn where everybody came from and what they were about. And then after dinner, they performed excerpts from all three movements of the piece. And after each movement, there was an opportunity for small group discussion where people just got to react honestly to what they heard. And at the end of that experience, there was a large group discussion that sort of began to clarify what were the important things about this piece, what worked well, maybe what didn't, and especially who this piece was for, where it might be premiered, who it should be played for. And then also it led to the application for significant funding, which was successful to create other pieces like this. And it was about bringing the community into the creative process and creating something that was stronger because of that deeper engagement than just had it been created on its own. Program evaluation and measurement is adapted from the human services field in the nonprofit sector. It's something I learned about a bunch in the certificate that I got. And again, this isn't applied in a one-to-one ratio, much like design thinking. But it basically comes to two different fields. We have needs assessment and we have qualitative evaluation. So needs assessment is co-determining the needs of a community with the members of that community in a scientific and ethical manner. And you do this through surveying things like secondary data, such as census data, or also doing surveys and focus groups and interviews and talking to key informants that know a community really well. We did this within the music technology course that we were looking to offer. When we decided that this was sort of the issue we wanted to address, we very quickly began looking at census data and also the availability of programs that might teach the sorts of skills and provide the equipment we were looking to provide. And what we found was that one, Clark County, which is the county in which the University of Georgia resides, is one of the poorest counties in Georgia. And any of the programs that were going to teach what we were looking to teach were about 50 miles away and prohibitively expensive for the average income of a person within Clark County. They're all near Atlanta and very expensive. And so once we understood sort of the baseline of that problem, we went and began talking to connections within the School of Social Work as well as within the local education system to potentially find the best way to address this problem, which led us to the after-school academic enrichment program at the local middle school and the partners we found there, and they really helped influence the kind of program that we decided to offer. And then qualitative evaluation happens after needs assessment, and this is the idea of using similar methods like focus groups, surveys, key informants to determine if a project is actually meeting its intended goals. And you're asking the participants themselves if it's doing that. And again, this is something that's continually done over the course of a project to make sure that everything is going the way that it should be and that it's still being effective. Sphinx organization does this really, really well. Their executive director, who I interviewed for this research, talked about how surveys of all participants in any Sphinx organization program are surveyed. And they're asked to provide feedback about what they were a part of so that those programs could be continued to be improved, but also new programs could be created based on that feedback. And finally, nonprofit management and grant writing is another important part of this. And this is mostly just due to the way that funding works in creative placemaking. So there's a lot of government and private foundation support for creative placemaking that is attached to 501c3 nonprofit status. And so most of the work happening in creative placemaking occurs in the nonprofit sector. And so students and pre-professionals that are looking to get involved in creative placemaking and do it on a big systemic level should be prepared to work in the nonprofit sector. And learning the organizational structure of a nonprofit is vital to being successful in it, especially the way that the executive director relates to the board of directors, who in turn, the executive director then relates to the staff and the staff relates to volunteers. And having some understanding of how all of those dynamics work and create successful projects is very important. And in particular within nonprofit management is this idea of grant writing. It's a particularly useful skill since most of that funding that's available for creative placemaking is attached to grants and foundation donations. And so learning how to write grants in the style that is required of these particular applications is important. I've taken 2 different grant writing classes, one through the Arts Leadership Program at Eastman and one through the School of Social Work. And I thought I knew how to write grants after that course in my master's, and I did not know how to write grants until taking that course through the social work school. And it's just a different style of writing and thinking that we don't typically access in music. And so now I briefly want to highlight these key challenges to implementing creative placemaking in higher ed. And especially when we're doing it in higher ed, this is going to affect the advocacy and allyship piece as well. And so they're worth thinking about in tandem. One, the timelines between creative placemaking and higher education are fundamentally misaligned. Creative placemaking projects are typically thought of in terms of years and decades. It's that idea of commitment, whereas higher education moves in 2 to 4 year increments. Students come in, they graduate. Faculty oftentimes move on to bigger and better teaching positions at other places. However, this transient population can be turned into a benefit if courses and learning opportunities are constructed with significant community engagement and service learning or experiential learning potential. That way, you're creating a system of investment where students are more likely to become invested in the local economy and stay after graduation, or faculty build up relationships that keep them there. However, there is a lack of alignment in traditional student and faculty incentives, such as degree completion and promotion and tenure, with the activities that are typically encompassed by creative placemaking. So things that go towards something like promotion and tenure, such as presenting at national and international conferences, or recording or service to the school, don't line up with those activities that typically constitute creative placemaking, like that relationship building piece. And so to address this issue, it'll take some reimagination of the way that perhaps things are awarded in higher education. And finally, there's this issue of ownership in higher education work. For example, this research that I'm doing, in order to graduate with a doctorate, I had to own the research that I was doing, which is in direct contrast to the communal ownership model that's inherent in creative placemaking, where the artist owns the work, but also the community owns the work. And the government agents that helped owned the work, and the funders also owned the work, or other stakeholders. And so just again, it will take some reimagination on the behalf of higher education to address this issue of ownership. And so to conclude, I just want to talk briefly. I know that I've thrown a lot of information at you, and I hope some of it has come through. But I believe that this research has demonstrated that creative placemaking has a defined role in informing the continued evolution of music, and especially classical music, as it adapts to cultural change in the 21st century. But if this field is going to continue to grow, higher education must begin training the musicians of tomorrow in the core principles that I've identified in order to really set us up for success. And this research is definitely not the end. It's only a stepping off point. There's significant need for further study. I specifically shied away from building curriculum in this study, partly because I'm not getting a PhD in music education, and so it was sort of outside of the purview of my degree to address curriculum. But more importantly, because hopefully I've demonstrated the need for an individual assessment, and you need to build a curriculum that really works for the community and also the students that are involved in that. And so each institution kind of has to do that on their own. There's also the methods of delivery, which are how you are basically saying that somebody is an expert in this, whether it's something like a graduate degree or an undergraduate degree. Could it be something like a minor or a certificate? And then what this really gets into is the philosophical discussion with people that I've had in this field are, what are these principles? Some people believe that these principles are core musicianship skills, and so they should just be a part of the curriculum that everybody learns, whereas other people are more comfortable with them being things that are delivered on the side. And so again, I think that requires further research as well. There's also this idea of mentorship, which I think is important, and one of the ways we can combat that misalignment of timelines, where we set up systems that allow for professors and professionals to work with students continually, even after those 2 to 4 years, in a really systemic and impactful way to deliver expertise and provide feedback for people looking to get into this field. And this is something that the Committee on the Status of Women does a great job of through the Women's Mentoring Program, which has been opened up to people of all genders now. And finally, the role of advocacy and allyship, and particularly how these tenets can be applied to social impact groups like the Committee on the Status of Women. And I think there are things that we can learn, whether it's how we listen in a performance or how we structure the way that we create things, or perhaps the way we apply cultural humility to our interactions as musicians with other musicians of different backgrounds, are really important facets that can be used to both serve the mission of the Committee on the Status of Women as well as the music field at large. So I know that was a ton of information and thrown a lot at you, and I want to thank everybody for their attention. Hopefully nobody's fallen asleep like my dog has. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to chat for as long as possible within the Zoom group chat, or maybe we can open up mics so people can talk out loud. And again, thank you so much for being here and just listening to me talk about something that I care a lot about, and hopefully maybe found some other people that might believe in it as well. Thank you so much. Thanks, Doc. Thanks, Dr. Baker. Ah, gotcha. Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Nikki. Get some questions. Okay, lots of questions. Good. I'll tackle Grace's question first. So it's interesting trying to apply those things practically. And I guess this actually will sort of connect to Dr. Baker's question as well. Especially now, one of the things that was really interesting when I was defending this research a couple of weeks ago was thinking about how it relates to the world that we currently live in, right? And so all of the research that I've done and all of the skills that I built up, I can't really put into practice right now because you can't interact with people in a one-on-one situation. And so unfortunately, no, I haven't been able to put a project in the works yet. I'm really hopeful when I have a better idea about where I'll end up at the end of this and hopefully at the beginning of next year. I'm prioritizing immediately putting community relationships and that sort of building blocks at the front of what I'm doing. One way that I am kind of currently working on this, and people that are in here that are part of Fuego can attest to, is we really prioritize community engagement as a part of our programming. So in addition to taking the usual sort of performance opportunities such as playing at schools or on concert series when we program, we also think a lot about how we can engage with the local community wherever we happen to be performing. And that's a huge part of the way that we try to program, both in terms of the music that we pick, but also where we perform and the people that we interact with. Again, so much of that has been put on hold recently, but that's kind of the way that I've been doing it right now. And it's very much at the forefront of my priorities going forward. In terms of applying these things practically, I think it's a matter of beginning to sort of understand some of those core principles in as best of the way as you can, Grace. And this is something we also talked about in the defense, was this idea of sort of levels. And it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in cultural humility and program evaluation and management and grant writing in order to be able to do a project at all. But beginning to build some of the skills and the mindset in those places. And there are plenty of resources available online to do that. Or I'm happy to send you my paper too, now that it's all done. And then this is a field that you learn by doing. So much of my learnings during this project came from the projects that I tried to do. And of course, I learned stuff from reading books and talking to people that have done the work. But it didn't prepare me to try and actually do it. And so I totally advocate for just beginning to become familiar with those principles and sort of what sort of dynamics are at play, and then just jump in and try, because things are going to go wrong, and that's where we learn the most. I've learned so much from the project that never got off the ground in terms of how to build those relationships that I wouldn't have learned if we had managed to get a project going. Now, does that answer your question, Grace? No problem. Hope I didn't put any words in Nikki and Gabe's mouth about how we operate in Fuego, but that is pretty important to me in terms of the way that we operate. I know that we've been trying to do that. I'm especially interested in the angle too that I took when thinking about this presentation, because I've given a version of this presentation several times now, and thinking about the ways that it can serve the Committee on the Status of Women, and that advocacy and allyship. That's such an important part of what this committee is trying to do and the way it's trying to change the field. And I was immediately surprised by how easy the connections were to make. But beyond how easy the connections were to make, it felt like the things that I was thinking about in terms of the ways to engage with the community more deeply translated really, really well to how to just interact with a different person's experience. So, for example, as a male saxophonist, there are things that I have never experienced that female saxophonists have. And so thinking in the ways that I've learned to think as a community organizer and as a creative placemaker has dramatically impacted the way that I've understood the Committee on the Status of Women's mission and the activities of that organization. And I think it's useful for other people that are looking to sort of get more involved and really understand how that stuff works to think in this way. So hopefully that came across in the presentation as well. Also, just a huge thank you for everybody for being here. I know that there's been a lot of these things recently. I'm assuming people are probably starting to get webinared out, but I really appreciate seeing all of you guys here. Yeah, great question, Jonathan. This is also something that was addressed in the defense and something we've been thinking about a lot, both myself and the committee and the people I've been partnering with on projects. I think it does come back to that idea of levels. And certainly there is there's some variance, right, in the sort of capacity of undergraduates, especially some undergraduates come in really just needing help on the horn and getting sort of their feet under them as musicians, and putting all of this extra stuff on top might be a bit too much. I know that Dr. Frigo went to a presentation that I don't think had anything to do with music, but they talked about maybe restricting this kind of music making or art making to graduate study, where people have their ducks more in a row and then can add this extra stuff on. I don't know if I necessarily agree that it should be restricted to graduate study, but perhaps things can be structured in a way where perhaps before undergrads are really thinking about leading a project, they are just participating in it, whether as a performer or perhaps observing the planning process. And if faculty models are put in place where they're providing sort of an inside look into the experience of not just saying like, hey, come and play for this community event that we're doing, but they're actually talking to the students about how that event was put together and what sorts of choices were made and how those relationships were built, they can start beginning to grow their capacity alongside the capacity of the instrument in order to perhaps engage with it more successfully. I would hesitate to just throw a student off the cliff with this and say, go out and do this. And the research has suggested that actually can do more harm than good. Arizona State put together a project that worked with students on community engaged projects because they got a pile of money from the university to do projects like this. And so they worked with, I think, 11 students and 2 different faculty members sort of introduced the concept of creative placemaking to the students and then just turned them loose and said, go out and do a project. And what they found was that only a couple of the projects actually met the sort of threshold that they were looking at for creative placemaking. And what they learned was that they really needed the faculty and the other teachers, whether that's older students or teaching assistants, to be a little bit more involved in demonstrating and mentoring in order to make sure that things got to the place that they were supposed to be. So I would definitely say that undergraduate students, perhaps older undergraduate students that have the capacity, can of course begin to lead projects on their own, but institutional support is really critical, which is difficult because right now, not every institution is backing this. Certain institutions are doing it better than others. That being said, The University of Georgia is a good example. We don't have like an arts leadership office or music entrepreneurship office like Arizona State or the University of Michigan. But there are resources available, especially at large Research One universities, like a School of Social Work or something like that, that are available to students if they know how to, and especially if they have faculty help to look for them. And in terms of how you go about establishing a relationship with nonprofits in the community, Megan, that's another loaded question. And it's really, really tricky. One of the questions I got in another version of this presentation, I think, was how do you look for a job in a nonprofit organization? And in my experience with the nonprofit stuff that I've done in Athens, it's mostly by word of mouth. There's not like a clearinghouse, like a higher ed jobs thing or something like that that people typically go to. But my best suggestion for how to get involved with nonprofits right now, especially if you're not looking for a job, is just to start volunteering. Find a group that you care about, especially the mission and the people involved with it, and just start showing up. That was a word that was used all of the time when I was talking to people in street symphonies. This is the idea of showing up. And it was what we didn't do correctly when we tried to get that other project together that celebrated cultural diversity in Athens. We didn't show up at first. So then when we tried to start a musical project, they didn't know who we were. And they didn't really have any reason to respond to us. But if we had begun investing in them, whether it was through volunteer work or going to their events or just meeting the people in those organizations, things might have gone a little bit better. And so I think that's the first place I would start. Every nonprofit looks for volunteers. Every single nonprofit should have sort of a robust way to find volunteers. And so just go and start that way. And then as you volunteer more and more, and I know that you were involved in the nonprofit program here at UGA while you were here too, as you volunteer more and more, they begin to trust you and they ask you to do more because nonprofits always need help. And so that's where I would start is by volunteering. And if you can do it in more than one organization as you have time, like I think that's great. Lots of times nonprofit organizations also share their volunteer rosters. And so you can bring together multiple different organizations that might be willing to work together on something rather than just you working with one organization. It's one of the challenges too about doing this work in higher ed is like as music students, we're so limited for time already. And so finding the time to volunteer can be tricky, I know. But if it's something that's important to you, I think it's very, very relevant and vitally important to this kind of work, to build that relationship through showing up. Yeah, no problem. To kind of extend off of what Megan just asked you about finding or creating a relationship in nonprofits in the community, another group of people that's worth thinking about when doing this is who are your musician partners as well. The more people that you get involved in a project, the better. And so something like the Committee on the Status of Women's Community Engagement Project, the more partners that they get involved in that, especially other musicians, the wider reach that it'll have, but also hopefully the more detailed and effective the plan will end up being because they have more input. And as long as systems are built up to facilitate that input, you can really create more meaningful projects that way. And so be thinking too about not only like who in the community and nonprofit organization sphere you would want to partner with, but who are your musician friends that you'd also want to partner with, Megan? It's worth thinking about. Yeah, no problem, Dr. Baker. Thank you. This is something that your chamber music ensemble already does pretty well, and I know you talked about it a little bit in your webinar. But it's just wonderful to see that other people are talking about this as well. Thank you too, Dr. Frigo. I appreciate all of your input and help. I'm excited to see where it goes as well. Well, it does look like people are sort of beginning to head out. Again, if, and this is for anybody too that listens to this perhaps after the fact, if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Facebook or my email address or through any of the different social media channels. I'd love to talk to you about this and hear what you have to say and get feedback and all of that. It's something I care a lot about, and I hope that other people, it seems like they do also care about it and are really thinking deeply about how to apply their music going forward. And so I talk about this all the time. I'm happy to continue talking about it. So please reach out if you're at all interested. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here.